Abbey Road Studios, Studio 2, September 1968. George Harrison sat on a wooden stool in the corner with an acoustic guitar waiting for his turn. Paul McCartney was at the piano recording another take of Martha, My Dear, a song that required only Paul and a string arrangement. John Lennon had not arrived yet. Ringo Starr drank tea and read a newspaper. George had brought in 3 new songs that week. None of them had been properly attempted. He had mentioned this twice. Paul said they would get to them. George looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. They had been in the studio since 3 in the afternoon working on Paul's material. When the string session finished, Paul asked if they could try one more take. George Martin said the orchestra was booked until 11. Paul said just one more. The musicians stayed. George remained on the stool, not playing, not needed. At 11:15, Paul declared the song finished and suggested they break for the night. George said he had brought in While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and they still had not recorded a proper version. Paul said they were all tired. George said they had been there for 8 hours and had not attempted a single one of his songs. Paul said they would start with it tomorrow. George asked when tomorrow would actually arrive. Paul looked at him and said, "When we've finished the more important things." The sentence hung in the air. George later told an interviewer he was not sure if Paul meant it the way it sounded or if it simply came out wrong. Either way, the meaning was clear. George's songs were not important things. They were what you recorded when you had time left over. "I felt like a session musician in my own band," George said in a 1977 interview with Crawdaddy. "I'd sit there for hours, waiting while they worked on their stuff. And when it was finally my turn, everyone was too tired or too bored to give it proper attention." The hierarchy had been established early. In 1963, when the Beatles first achieved national success, George was 20 years old, the youngest member, and already understood that the band belonged to John and Paul. They wrote the songs, they sang lead, they gave the interviews. George played guitar and sang harmony and stood slightly behind them in photographs. "Nobody ever said it explicitly," George recalled in Anthology. "But we all knew. John and Paul were the Beatles. Me and Ringo were the other 2. Dick James, the Beatles' music publisher, had structured the songwriting credits and royalties to favor Lennon and McCartney compositions exclusively. Even when George began writing songs in 1963, he received standard performer royalties but no songwriting income from his own compositions on Beatles records. "I'd write a song and it would go on the B-side maybe," George said in 1968, "or it wouldn't be used at all. Meanwhile, John and Paul would have 3 or 4 songs each on every album. I asked why. They said because their songs were stronger. I asked how they knew if they never properly tried mine." Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager until his death in 1967, reinforced the structure. "Brian saw John and Paul as the asset," Peter Brown recalled. "George and Ringo were important, but they weren't the draw. When TV shows wanted the Beatles, they really wanted Lennon and McCartney. Brian understood that. George understood it too. He just didn't accept it." In a 1965 Melody Maker interview, a journalist asked George how it felt to be in the shadow of 2 great songwriters. George replied, "I don't think of it as a shadow. We're a band." The journalist noted that George's smile did not reach his eyes. By 1966, George had become interested in Indian music and philosophy. He began studying sitar with Ravi Shankar and spent increasing time in India, often alone. "George was trying to find something outside the Beatles," Ravi Shankar said in a 1997 interview. "He was searching for meaning beyond pop music. He felt limited by his role in the band." George himself said in 1967, "The Beatles is fine, but it's not everything. There's a whole universe of music and ideas out there. I want to explore that, but every time I bring something new to the band, it's seen as George's weird Indian phase. John and Paul can do anything they want and it's genius. I do something different and it's indulgent." The condescension was often subtle but constant. During the Revolver sessions in 1966, George brought in Love You Too, a song entirely based on Indian instrumentation and structure. Paul and John did not play on it. George recorded it with outside musicians. They didn't know what to do with it, Jeff Emerick recalled, so they just let George do his thing in the corner while they worked on their songs. It wasn't hostile, it was worse. It was indifferent. When Revolver was released, Love You Too received minimal attention. George's other contribution, Taxman, opened the album and was praised by critics. George later said, "They liked Taxman because it sounded like a Beatles song. They ignored Love You Too because it didn't." In 1967, during the Sgt. Pepper sessions, George contributed one song, Within You Without You. It was a 9-minute meditation on Eastern philosophy with no other Beatles playing on it. George was essentially a guest artist on his own song, George Martin said. He came in, recorded it with session musicians, and left. The others never even heard it until it was finished. When Paul suggested sequencing it in the middle of side 2, John asked if they had to include it at all. George was in the room. Paul said yes, they had to, George recalled in 1980, because it would look bad if I didn't have a song on the album. Not because it was good, because it would look bad. The resentment accumulated slowly. In early 1968, the Beatles traveled to India to study meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. George was the most committed to the experience. George took it seriously, Ringo said. The rest of us were interested, but George was devoted. He really wanted to change his life. When the group left India early amid rumors about the Maharishi's behavior, George was devastated. He felt betrayed, Pattie Boyd, George's wife at the time, wrote in her memoir. Not just by the Maharishi, but by the others for not believing in it. George had invested himself completely. John and Paul were already bored and ready to leave. George felt abandoned. The White Album sessions in the summer and autumn of 1968 made the power structure explicit. The band had 30 songs to record. John had approximately 12. Paul had approximately 12. George had 6. I'd bring in songs and they'd say, "We don't have time," George said in 1969. Or they'd say, "Let's try it," and then spend 10 minutes on it before moving to one of Paul's things. They'd spend 3 days perfecting Paul's songs. Mine got an afternoon if I was lucky. Not While I'm Around was rejected entirely. Sour Milk Sea was given to another artist. Circles was not attempted. George finally insisted they record While My Guitar Gently Weeps, but the first version was dismissed as too slow. Paul said it was boring, George recalled. John said it didn't go anywhere. I said we'd barely tried it. Paul said he could tell from the demo. I asked when we'd started judging songs from demos. Paul didn't answer. George brought in Eric Clapton to play lead guitar on the final version. I brought Eric because I thought if I had an outsider there, they'd have to take it seriously, George told Rolling Stone in 1979. They couldn't just dismiss it if Eric Clapton was playing on it, and it worked. Suddenly everyone was focused, but I shouldn't have needed to do that. It was humiliating. The song became one of the album's standouts. George received compliments from critics and fans. John and Paul did not mention it. Piggies, George's second contribution to the White Album, was arranged primarily by Paul, who played harpsichord and suggested the string arrangement. Paul improved it, no question, George said. But he also took it over. It stopped being my song and became our song, which is fine, I guess. Except my songs became our songs, and their songs stayed their songs. Chris Thomas, who assisted George Martin during the sessions, recalled, George Harrison would present something, and immediately Paul would start rearranging it. George would resist at first, then give in. You could see it wore him down. The third song, Long, 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 was recorded late one night with minimal input from the others. Nobody cared about that one, George said. So I just did it quickly and moved on. It's actually one of my favorites from that album. Maybe because they left me alone. The song was sequenced at the end of side 3, easy to overlook. Most fans did not notice it. By December 1968, George had concluded that his position in the Beatles was permanent and unchangeable. I realized I would always be the third Beatle, he said in a 1987 interview. Not even the third and fourth. Me and Ringo were the backing band for Lennon and McCartney. That's how they saw it. That's how the world saw it, and nothing I did would change that. Pattie Boyd wrote, George came home from the studio one night and said, I've had enough. I asked what happened. He said, nothing happened. That's the problem. Nothing ever happens with my songs. In January 1969, the band attempted the Get Back project at Twickenham Studios. George arrived the first day with All Things Must Pass and Let It Down, 2 songs he had been working on for months. Paul suggested they start with one of his new songs instead. George said they should work on everyone's material equally. Paul said they would, but they needed to establish a direction first. George asked why Paul's direction was the default. Paul said someone had to organize things or they would accomplish nothing. George said maybe accomplishing nothing would be better than accomplishing only what Paul wanted. The argument was captured on film. Michael Lindsay Hogg, the director, later said, you could see George's frustration. He wasn't angry. He was exhausted. Like he'd been making the same argument for years, and nobody listened. Paul tried to smooth things over. He said, let's just play and we'll figure it out, George recalled. But that was the problem. We never figured it out. We just defaulted to John and Paul's songs. On January 6th, during a rehearsal of 2 of us, Paul told George how to play his guitar part. He demonstrated on a bass, showing the rhythm he wanted. George said he knew how to play it. Paul said he was just offering a suggestion. George said it was not a suggestion if Paul demonstrated exactly what he wanted. Paul said he was trying to help the song. George said, I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you prefer. Whatever pleases you, I'll do it. The exchange was polite and cold. Glyn Johns, the engineer, recalled, George's tone was completely flat. He was done fighting. He was just stating facts. Paul looked uncomfortable, but he didn't back down. Ringo sat silently. John was in the corner with Yoko, not paying attention. On January 10th, during a discussion about arrangements, Paul again suggested how George should play a particular section. George put down his guitar and said, See you around the clubs. He walked out. The cameras kept filming. Paul immediately suggested they continue as a 3-piece or bring in Eric Clapton. John said nothing. Ringo said maybe they should take a break. Paul said they could not afford to take a break. Ringo said maybe George had a point. Paul asked what point. Ringo said that we don't listen to him. George did not return for 5 days. During that time, Paul, John, and Ringo discussed whether to replace him. Paul thought we could continue, Ringo said in Anthology. John didn't care either way. I said we were the Beatles, all 4 of us, and if George left, we should call it quits. Negotiations happened through intermediaries. George's conditions for returning, move out of Twickenham, abandon the live concert plan, and record his songs without interference. Paul agreed. The band relocated to Apple Studios in the basement of their Savile Row office. George returned on January 21st. The atmosphere was strained but functional. Everyone was polite, George said. Too polite. We were like co-workers who didn't like each other but needed to finish a project. 2 of George's songs were included in the sessions, For You Blue, a simple blues that required minimal arrangement, and I Me Mine, which was recorded months later without John, who had already left the band. Neither song received substantial attention during mixing. By the time they recorded Abbey Road in the summer of 1969, George had stopped expecting equal treatment. He contributed 2 songs, Something and Here Comes the Sun. Both became classics. Something was released as a single, the first Harrison A-side in the Beatles' history. Frank Sinatra called it the best love song of the past 50 years. "I was thrilled," George said in 1977, "but also bitter, because it took 7 years for them to put one of my songs on the A-side, and it was only because John and Paul didn't have anything stronger that month." Here Comes the Sun was written in Eric Clapton's garden while George skipped a business meeting at Apple. "I was supposed to be at this meeting about money and contracts," George said. "And I thought, I don't care about any of that. I went to Eric's place and sat in his garden and wrote the song in an afternoon. It was one of the easiest songs I ever wrote, because I wasn't thinking about the Beatles or the hierarchy or any of that. I was just writing. Neither John nor Paul played on Here Comes the Sun. George recorded it with Ringo and session musicians. It's a Beatles song without Lennon or McCartney on it," George said in 1979. Which is appropriate, really, because by then we were barely a band anymore. In September 1969, John announced he was leaving the Beatles. George's response, according to Peter Brown, was relief. George said, "Good. It's about time," Brown recalled. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Tired of fighting for space, tired of being the third Beatle, tired of the whole thing. When Paul tried to hold the band together and plan another album, George said he would participate, but he wanted equal songwriting representation. "I said I had dozens of songs ready," George told Musician magazine in 1987. "Paul said we'd see. I said no, we wouldn't see. Either I get the same number of songs as you and John, or I'm out. Paul didn't agree. So I was out." The legal dissolution of the Beatles took years. George supported Paul's lawsuit to end the partnership. "People thought that was strange," George said, "that I'd side with Paul. But I wasn't siding with Paul. I was siding with ending the Beatles. Paul wanted to end it legally. I wanted to end it completely. We agreed on that, even if we agreed on nothing else." George's first solo album, All Things Must Pass, was released in November 1970. It was a triple album, 30 songs, many of them rejected by the Beatles. The critical and commercial response was overwhelming. It outsold both John's and Paul's solo debuts. The single My Sweet Lord became the biggest-selling single by any former Beatle. "I felt vindicated," George said in 1971. "Not in a petty way. Just, here were all these songs the Beatles didn't have time for, and people loved them. It proved I was right. They were good songs. John and Paul just didn't want to hear them." Phil Spector, who produced the album, said in 1972, "George had been storing up these songs for years. He had so much to say, and nobody had let him say it. When we started recording, it just poured out of him." The album's success created tension with Paul and John, both of whom made dismissive comments in interviews. "Paul said something about how my album was overproduced," George recalled. "John said something about how I'd gotten lucky. It hurt, but it also clarified things. They still saw me as the third Beatle, even after the Beatles ended." The bitterness faded slowly. By the mid-1970s, George had largely withdrawn from public life, focusing on film production through handmade films and occasional recording. "I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore," he said in 1987. "I'd proven it with All Things Must Pass. After that, I could just make music for myself." He maintained cordial but distant relationships with Paul and Ringo. His relationship with John was more complicated. "John and I understood each other," George said in 1980, months before John's death. "We were both damaged by the Beatles in different ways. We could talk about that. Paul never understood. Paul still thinks it was the best time of our lives." In his final interview in 2001, weeks before his death from cancer, George was asked if he had regrets about his time in the Beatles. "I don't regret it," he said, "but I don't romanticize it either. It was a job. I was good at my job, but I was never allowed to be as good as I could have been. That's not John and Paul's fault. That's just how it was. The structure was set early, and structures are hard to break." The interviewer asked if he felt he had eventually received proper recognition. George smiled slightly. "Eventually," he said. "After I left." Abbey Road Studios, Studio 2, September 1968. George Harrison sat on a wooden stool in the corner with an acoustic guitar, waiting for his turn. Paul McCartney was at the piano recording another take of a song that did not require George. John Lennon had not arrived yet. Ringo Starr drank tea and read a newspaper. George had brought in 3 new songs that week. None of them had been attempted. He looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The session was almost over. He did not mention his songs again. He had learned that mentioning them changed nothing. He stayed on the stool, holding the guitar, waiting for a turn that would not come.